This is one of my favorite sketches of all time. It's not an architectural sketch, but this is Charles Darwin's sketch about the theory of evolution. So he simply said, I think, and then he changed history by helping us to understand history. So if I can compare the tall building to this sort of evolutionary cycle, if you think of birds, the very nature of a bird changes depending on its altitude, its vertical position. So you get the penguin, which is basically shaped for depth in the ocean. Ostrich, which is ideally suited for plus or minus 0. And then you get the eagle, which is designed for height. And if we look at buildings throughout time, and these are all at one point the tallest structures of their day, how the nature of construction and how tall buildings change and evolve as they need to go higher. Now, that being said, so there's certain traits that Ping An shares with other tall towers that we've done. What makes this one so unique is the densest tower. It's in terms of people, it's the sort of most concentrated tower that we've ever had to design. Okay, so if we take the building population, the permanent population is over 15,000 people, and imagine that stacked on top of a footprint which is only 72 by 72 meters. If you look at Shenzhen around you, if we built Shenzhen, all of the land area of Shenzhen, to that same density, we could fit 2 planets of Earth's population of workers into Shenzhen. So that's how dense Ping An is. Okay? And so then the story of density becomes one of a story of sustainability. So what we think about when we do these tall towers is density leading to sustainability. If the whole world indeed sort of just lived in Shenzhen and you can leave the rest of the planet in its natural state, then I think that would be a sustainable proposition. Okay, but of course that's a very tricky proposition. This is the Kowloon walled city, if any of you are familiar with it. It actually existed. It's been demolished, but it's the densest human habitation in history. It's 2 square meters per person. Okay. Thomas talked about some of the reasons why Ping An decided to build the tower here. I love this photo because you can actually see on the left-hand side that mountain belongs in Hong Kong. The mountain on the right-hand side is Shenzhen. And if you look at Shenzhen and the growth of Shenzhen, it's basically been developing along the border with Hong Kong in the east-west linear direction. Okay, and this is made possible by improvements in transportation. So if we think about the traditional city, in a traditional city like New York, we define things by pedestrian proximity. It takes 15 minutes to walk from the Empire State Building to the Chrysler Building. Now, with high-speed transportation, it takes us 15 minutes to go from ICC in Hong Kong to Ping An Financial Center in Shenzhen. So it begins to redefine our understanding of proximity. Okay, so Ping An and the chairman Ma Ming-tze, he essentially saw this tower as an extension of Hong Kong's central business district. Okay, now getting into how we do it. Okay, so structure plays a huge role when you do a tower like this. You can see commonalities already in the design of the structure with other super tall towers. Okay, and I put these images side by side because the design of the exterior and the structure, and I'll show the interior as in the core, need to occur simultaneously. And here you can see it coming up. And then just to give an appreciation of the scale of these structural elements, so we begin to inhabit this great infrastructure. I started talking about evolution. I think it's hard for me not to talk about Ping An without talking about Shanghai Financial Center and ICC in Hong Kong. So I was fortunate to work on both of these projects. So sort of taking certain elements of both of these, sort of putting them together in this new tower and pulling it up to an unprecedented height. Okay, from SWFC we really learned about this idea of compacting the tall building, so making its wind profile as compact as possible, and really developing this really tight symbiotic relationship between the tower's structure and the tower's form. And in terms of planning, and this is very important, that the form of the building and the way that it transforms has to support the ideal dimensions for the functions on the inside. In this case, it's office, hotel, and observation deck. Okay, from ICC, in this photo you can see ICC and its earlier sister project IFC on either side of the harbor. They're also connected by rail, 2 minutes apart. From ICC, it's a much more conservative form than SWFC, but nonetheless highly aerodynamic. So we learned that the kind of formal moves or strategies that you have to make a tower more aerodynamic can be very subtle. So in this case with IFC, it was simply taking a square and notching out the corners. And by simply widening the base and tapering the top, achieving huge structural benefit. The last lesson from ICC was the idea of the vertical transportation of the project being an extension of the horizontal infrastructure of the city. So when you look at Ping An, it's a little dot there, but you can see the vast network of subterranean infrastructure which supports that tall tower. So then when you look at the above grade, the tower begins to make sense because you see there's this whole world that exists below it. Okay, so like I said, it was taking those two prototypes but pulling them to an even greater height. And in many ways, that's how I began to see the form of the tower. So how do you take something so dense and so massive, still try to make it feel light and delicate? So the idea of pulling, stretching up the tower became the inspiration for the design. So in many ways, you start to see the form of the tower as being derived by the properties of the material. So the sort of just natural flow of the material from top to bottom. Okay. And then the idea of stretching is manifested in the facade material. So after some sort of discussions, we decided stainless steel would be the best facade material because it sort of also emphasized the ductility or the sort of stretchiness of the form, so it complemented the form. And that great image Thomas showed you, that stretchiness, the ductility occurs below grade as well in the form of the piles, which amazingly, and this is a photo inside of one of those, was done by hand. So there you see it. So the idea is the tower feels poised. It's sort of strung between the earth and this point in the sky. So it's an object in equilibrium. How is most of the efficiency achieved? And I think most of the efficiency occurs in the core. So we've seen a lot of forms over the years. No one's talked about the core that much. From the point of view of a design architect, I like to see the core. Well, first of all, I think core is a terrible word, so I'm going to call it engine, because I think it's a dynamic component. It much more aptly describes the sort of excitement of this major element in the super tall. So when you talk about sustainability and the 600 meter tall building, I don't really see it in those terms. Sustainability is like a Toyota Prius, right? But when you're dealing with the 600 meter tall, we're talking about high performance sports cars. So the discussion becomes a little bit different. It becomes about performance. So when we look at performance, and if you look at Audi, okay, in 6 years between their A6 models, it's interesting because they managed to get the car to go faster. Okay. They managed to get more horsepower out of the vehicle. Okay. But at the same time, they increased the gas mileage. So it uses less gas, okay, per mile. So it became more efficient. Okay, so you can see power goes up 30%, speed 40%, fuel economy goes up 30%. And some of that improvement is in the aerodynamic contouring, but just a little bit, 10% of that. So the rest of it was done through making the engine more efficient. But first, just to talk about some of the aerodynamic shaping principles. I think if you've gone to CTBUH events before, you're starting to become very familiar with the basic principles. So the square extrusion is perhaps the worst thing that you can do when it comes to aerodynamics. So splaying out the base, tapering the top, corner treatment, and doming of the top Very important strategy. So by doing this, we reduced the structural force by 35%. Okay? And as things progressed, we did certain things, like as the columns started becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not TT's fault, but anyhow, they became bigger and bigger. Rather than pinching the internal space, we just pushed the columns outside the building, which was a great design move as well, because I think that that leads to the expression and enhancement of the form. Okay, so it's thinking about internal needs. So we push the structure outwards so that we can keep the mega diagonals and the trusses tight to the curtain mold. And that just gives you an appreciation of the scale of the mega column. Now, going back to the engine, so the engine needs to be shaped. It needs to be massed, okay, at the same time that you're massing the building. So you think of them hand in hand. The challenge here was we're starting with the square floor plate, so we adopted a square core. As you go to the top of the tower, the floor profile becomes more octagonal. So the core needs to be shaped to go from a square into a cruciform. Okay, so the exterior and the core designed in parallel, literally. And here you can see that transformation in the core. Lastly, to talk about the spire, okay, which is like the lightning rod of the project. Okay, that's where we attain the height. Okay, so it's the symbol of the tower. It feels like the only natural way to resolve a tower, but then to achieve it technically, of course, extremely challenging. And you start to look at everything that you actually need to put at the top of one of these buildings, and then now imagine trying to put that and still create a public space at the top. Huge challenge. But then why do it? Why go through that trouble to create the public space at the top of the tower? And I think ultimately that's our responsibility. So these objects, these tallest towers in cities, they perform a civic function. And so bringing people to the top of the tower should be a goal, I think, of every one of these structures. So we wanted to make the world's scariest observation deck, so we actually push out the glass in a triangular bay window. So you get a space between every little pier. You can get up and look down the facade. Okay, but that's the story, because at the end of the day, the story of the tall building is a human story. So it's about lifting up our experience. It's about allowing people to participate in the joy of height. And if you look at, it's a famous picture when they were building the Empire State Building. And now, 80 years later in Shenzhen, and you see that the story really hasn't changed. Okay, and just a note, we put up some of these construction photos on the wall outside, and the whole idea is to sort of show that relationship between people and the tall building, because I think that's what really makes it special.